Welcome to Facts Radio, your journey through history begins here. In this episode, we explore Pearl Harbor, the attack that changed the world. It was a morning that began with the soft lap of waves against steel hulls and the rustle of palm trees in a warm trade wind, a scene of deceptive tranquility that would soon be shattered by the most significant intelligence failure in American history. We are transporting you back to December 7, 1941, to witness the moment the geopolitical tectonic plates shifted violently, dragging the United States from the sidelines into the heart of the greatest conflict humanity has ever known. This is not just a story of strategy and explosions, it is a mosaic of human courage, tragic oversight, and the terrifying unpredictability of war. Chapter 1: The Gathering Storm. To understand the inferno of Pearl Harbor, we must first look into the shadows of the months leading up to it, where diplomacy was slowly dying a quiet death. By late 1941, the Empire of Japan was a coiled spring, expanding aggressively across Asia in search of resources to feed its war machine. The United States, attempting to curb this aggression without firing a shot, had imposed a crippling oil embargo that threatened to strangle the Japanese economy and military within months. In Tokyo, military leaders and politicians faced a stark, binary choice: retreat from their conquests and lose face, or strike south to seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, was a man torn between duty and foresight. Having studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington, he knew the industrial might of the United States better than almost anyone in the Japanese high command. He famously warned his superiors that while he could run wild for the first 6 months or a year of conflict, he had utterly no confidence in a victory for the second or third year. Yet, despite his reservations, he was a warrior bound by loyalty, and he began to conceive a plan that was as audacious as it was desperate. The strategy relied on a knockout blow, a preemptive strike designed to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet at its anchorages in Hawaii. The logic was cold and calculating: if the American battleships were destroyed, the U.S. Navy would be unable to interfere with Japan's southern expansion for at least 6 months. Yamamoto gathered his staff and began planning an aerial assault that required absolute secrecy and technical innovation. They studied the geography of Pearl Harbor meticulously, noting its shallow waters which were thought to be safe from torpedo attacks. Imagine the tension in those smoke-filled war rooms in Tokyo, where men pushed wooden markers across giant maps, deciding the fate of thousands. The plan was technically illegal under international law without a declaration of war, a point that troubled some but was overruled by the necessity of surprise. The pilots selected for this mission were the elite of the elite, samurai of the sky who trained relentlessly in Kagoshima Bay, which geographically resembled Pearl Harbor. They practiced low-level flying and torpedo drops until the maneuvers became muscle memory, unaware at first of their specific target. Across the ocean, Washington was buzzing with intercepted cables and diplomatic noise, a cacophony of signals that created more confusion than clarity. American intelligence, specifically the cryptanalysts working on the magic intercepts, had broken Japan's diplomatic codes and knew that war was imminent. However, the prevailing belief was that the strike would fall on the Philippines or Malaya, closer to Japan's resource targets. It is hard to believe, but the idea that Japan would attempt to strike Hawaii, thousands of miles across the open ocean, was dismissed by many as a logistical impossibility. As November turned to December, the diplomatic facade began to crumble entirely, with envoys Nomura and Kurusu presenting proposals in Washington that they knew were likely futile. The clock was ticking down, not in hours, but in the dwindling oil reserves of the Japanese Navy. The decision was finally made, sealed with the Emperor's approval, to launch the operation known as Z. The die was cast, and the machinery of war began to turn with a terrifying, silent momentum. Chapter 2: The Silent Armada. On November 26, 1941, a fleet of ghosts slipped out of Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands, heading into the desolate, storm-tossed waters of the North Pacific. This was the Kido Butai, the mobile force, comprising 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, and a screen of cruisers and destroyers. They sailed under the strictest radio silence, with key telegraph keys literally removed from transmitters to prevent any accidental slip that could alert the Americans. The route was chosen specifically to avoid commercial shipping lanes, taking them through rough, freezing seas that tested the endurance of every sailor and the structural integrity of the ships. Life aboard the carriers, like the flagship Akagi, was a mix of rigid discipline and mounting anxiety. Pilots spent their days studying silhouettes of American ships, memorizing the profiles of the USS Arizona, the Oklahoma, and the West Virginia. Mechanics worked around the clock in the hangars, tuning the engines of the Zeros, Vals, and Kates, ensuring that not a single horsepower would be lost. The seas were so rough that destroyers had to be refueled by hand hoses from the larger ships, a dangerous dance of steel and oil on heaving waves. The technical challenges facing the Japanese were immense, particularly regarding their torpedoes. Pearl Harbor was only 40 feet deep in places, meaning standard aerial torpedoes would dive too deep and hit the mud before arming. To solve this, Japanese engineers attached wooden fins to the torpedoes, increasing their buoyancy and allowing them to run shallow and true. It was a stroke of engineering brilliance that the Americans would not discover until they were pulling fragments of steel from their burning hulls. Imagine standing on the flight deck of the Akagi at night, surrounded by nothing but the black ocean and the cold wind, knowing you are spearheading an attack on a sleeping giant. The sailors and pilots wrote letters home that they knew might never be delivered, preparing their souls for a death they viewed as honorable. As they drew closer to Hawaii, the tension ratcheted up. A single sighting by an American patrol plane or a merchant vessel would ruin the element of surprise and likely spell disaster for the fleet. On December 2, the fleet received the coded message from Tokyo: climb Mount Nitakaka. It was the final authorization. Negotiations had failed, and the attack was to proceed as planned. The ships increased speed, cutting through the waves with a renewed sense of grim purpose. The weather began to clear as they approached the launch point, the rough northern swells giving way to the calmer waters of the subtropics. Down in the briefing rooms, the pilots were finally shown the full scale of the operation and the specific location of the American ships, updated by spies in Honolulu. The mood shifted from anxiety to a zealous determination. They tied hachimaki headbands around their foreheads, symbolizing their resolve. They were told that the fate of the empire rested on their wings, a heavy burden for young men, many barely out of their teens. By the night of December 6, the fleet was approximately 230 miles north of Oahu, poised to unleash hell. The carriers turned into the wind, the flight decks buzzing with activity as planes were spotted and engines were warmed up in the pre-dawn darkness. It is chilling to realize that while these men prepared for war, the targets of their aggression were engaged in the mundane, peaceful activities of a Saturday night. Chapter 3: Paradise Unaware. While the Kido Butai lurked in the darkness to the north, the island of Oahu was basking in the glow of a perfect Saturday evening. In the officers' clubs and mess halls, bands played swing music, and men wrote letters to sweethearts back on the mainland, dreaming of Christmas leave. The fleet was in port, a majestic row of battleships lined up along Ford Island, their crews resting after a week of maneuvers. There was a sense of security, a belief that the fortress of Pearl Harbor was impregnable, protected by the vastness of the Pacific Ocean. Admiral Husband Kimmel and General Walter Short, the commanders in Hawaii, had received war warnings, but their focus was primarily on sabotage from the local population, not an aerial attack. Planes were parked wingtip to wingtip on the airfields to make them easier to guard against saboteurs, inadvertently creating perfect targets for bombers. Anti-aircraft ammunition was locked away in magazines, and the guns were unmanned, leaving the ships and airfields virtually defenseless against a sudden strike. Sunday morning, December 7th, dawned with a brilliant sunrise, the sky a tapestry of gold and violet scattered with puffy trade wind clouds. Civilians prepared for church, golfers headed to the courses, and sailors on the ships began their morning routines, raising flags and preparing for inspections. The smell of breakfast coffee and bacon wafted through the galleys, mixing with the scent of heavy fuel oil and the salt air. However, there were warning signs that went unheeded in the early hours of that fateful morning. At 6:45 a.m., the destroyer USS Ward spotted and engaged a midget submarine trying to sneak into the harbor entrance. The Ward fired its guns and dropped depth charges, sinking the intruder, and immediately sent a coded message to headquarters. Tragically, the report worked its way slowly through the chain of command, dismissed by some as a false alarm or a jittery crew. Meanwhile, at the Opana radar station on the northern tip of Oahu, two privates, George Elliott and Joseph Lawcock, were manning a mobile radar unit. At 7:02 a.m., they saw something unprecedented on their oscilloscope, a massive blip indicating a large formation of aircraft approaching from the north. It was the largest signal they had ever seen, representing the first wave of Japanese planes, but they were inexperienced and unsure of what they were looking at. They called the information center at Fort Shafter, where the only officer on duty was a young lieutenant named Kermit Tyler, who was essentially there for training. Tyler knew that a flight of American B-17 bombers was expected to arrive from the mainland that morning. He famously told the radar operators, "Don't worry about it," assuming the blip was the friendly bombers. It is a moment that history looks back on with agonizing frustration. The last chance to sound the alarm was lost in a casual dismissal. So, the island remained asleep, the protective net of radar and patrols failing at the critical moment. The Japanese planes, 183 of them in the first wave, roared closer, using the cloud cover to mask their approach until the very last minute. Below them, the lush green mountains of Oahu rose from the blue sea, a paradise about to be transformed into a slaughterhouse. Chapter 4, Tora. 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 At 7:48 a.m., the silence of the Sunday morning was shredded by the high-pitched whine of diving aircraft. Commander Mitsu Fukaida, leading the air attack, looked down through the breaks in the clouds and saw the U.S. Pacific Fleet sitting peacefully at anchor, completely unaware of the doom descending upon them. He slid back his canopy and fired a flare to signal the attack, then radioed the code words Tora. Tora. Tora, back to the fleet, indicating that complete surprise had been achieved. The first bombs fell on the airfields at Wheeler and Hickam, where the tightly packed American planes exploded in chain reactions of fire and debris. Men ran out of their barracks in their underwear, staring up in disbelief at the planes bearing the red rising sun insignia. The confusion was absolute. Many thought it was a drill gone wrong until the machine gun bullets began tearing up the tarmac and the bodies of their comrades. Simultaneously, the torpedo bombers swept in low over the water, skimming the waves toward Battleship Row. They released their modified torpedoes, which dropped into the harbor and ran true, slamming into the sides of the USS Oklahoma and the USS West Virginia. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of metal rending, explosions booming, and the screams of men trapped below decks. The Oklahoma, hit by multiple torpedoes, began to capsize almost immediately, trapping hundreds of sailors inside her hull in total darkness. The most catastrophic moment came minutes later, when a high-altitude bomber dropped an armor-piercing bomb directly onto the USS Arizona. The bomb penetrated the forward deck and ignited the forward ammunition magazine, which contained over 1 million pounds of gunpowder. The resulting explosion was a cataclysmic event, lifting the 33,000-ton ship out of the water and breaking her in two. A fireball rose hundreds of feet into the air, incinerating everything and everyone in its vicinity. The harbor was now a sea of fire, with oil leaking from the ruptured ships burning on the surface of the water. Sailors who had been blown overboard were forced to swim through the flames, choking on the thick, black smoke that blotted out the sun. Heroism emerged instantly amidst the chaos. Men manned anti-aircraft guns on sinking ships, pulled wounded comrades from the fire, and refused to abandon their posts even as the water rose around them. Reflect for a moment on the sheer sensory overload of that hour, the smell of burning flesh and oil, the roar of engines, the concussion of blasts that shook the very ground of the island. The surprise was so complete, and the devastation so immediate, that the American response was initially disorganized, a desperate scramble for survival rather than a coordinated defense. By the time the first wave of Japanese planes turned back toward their carriers, the pride of the U.S. Navy was broken and burning. But the attack was not over. A second wave was already inbound, ready to pick apart whatever targets remained. The world had changed in less than an hour, and the sleeping giant was now wide awake, wounded, and filled with a terrible resolve. Chapter 5 of the Second Wave. The respite following the first wave was a terrifying lull, a hollow silence filled only by the crackle of burning fires and the cries of the wounded. For roughly 20 minutes, the sky was empty of enemy aircraft, allowing a brief, frantic moment for the Americans to assess the catastrophe. Men on the decks of ruined ships scrambled to issue ammunition, clearing jammed guns and setting fuses with trembling hands, knowing the enemy would return. It was a pause not of peace, but of anticipation, as I scanned the northern horizon where the black smoke of the Arizona mingled with the clouds. Then, at 8:54 a.m., the drone returned, a heavier, throatier rumble than before, signaling the arrival of 171 more aircraft. This was the second wave, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, tasked with finishing off the wounded giants and destroying the harbor's facilities. Unlike the first wave, however, these pilots did not find a sleeping victim, they found an awakened, angry, and armed fortress. The sky erupted with black puffs of anti-aircraft fire, a curtain of flak thrown up by every gun the sailors could bring to bear. The primary targets for this wave were the airfields and the dry docks, but the pilots also swarmed the battleship USS Nevada, the only capital ship to get underway. The Nevada, listing and burning, made a desperate dash for the channel in trance, her engine straining as her crew fought to save her. Seeing this, Japanese dive bombers swarmed her like hornets, intent on sinking her in the channel to bottle up the entire harbor. The water around the Nevada churned with near misses, and bombs tore through her forecastle, forcing her captain to beach the ship at Hospital Point to avoid sinking. Amidst the chaos, the Japanese pilots faced a much stiffer resistance, losing 20 aircraft in this second assault compared to only 9 in the first. American pilots, some of whom had managed to get airborne in P-40s and P-36s from outlying fields, engaged the enemy in desperate dogfights, outnumbered but fighting with ferocious resolve. It is hard to imagine the adrenaline of those few American flyers, weaving through their own anti-aircraft fire to tag the agile Zeros. By 9:45 a.m., the Japanese planes turned back toward their carriers, leaving behind a scene of apocalyptic destruction. Admiral Nagumo, aboard the Akagi, faced a critical decision: launch a third wave to destroy the oil storage tanks and repair shops, or withdraw while he still had the advantage. Cautious by nature and fearing the location of the American aircraft carriers, which were notably absent from the harbor, Nagumo chose to withdraw. It was a decision that would haunt the Japanese Empire, for by leaving the fuel and repair facilities intact, he allowed the sleeping giant to recover far faster than Yamamoto had ever feared. Chapter 6: Air Chaos and Courage. As the roar of the engines faded, the human drama on the ground shifted from combat to a desperate struggle for survival and rescue. The harbor waters were covered in a thick layer of burning oil, transforming the bay into a lethal, flaming moat that survivors had to traverse. Small boats, many manned by civilians and sailors who had barely escaped their own sinking ships, navigated this inferno, pulling oil-slicked men from the water. The courage displayed in those hours was instinctive and pervasive, ignoring rank, race, and protocol. On the USS West Virginia, a mess attendant named Dory Miller, who had never been trained to operate heavy weaponry due to the segregation policies of the time, stepped into history. Finding his captain mortally wounded, Miller manned an anti-aircraft machine gun and fired at the attacking planes until his ammunition was exhausted. His actions that day became a symbol of resilience, proving that heroism is defined by spirit, not by assignment. It serves as a poignant reminder that in the face of existential threat, the barriers of society often burn away, leaving only the raw content of character. Ashore, the hospitals were overwhelmed within minutes, transforming into scenes reminiscent of the Civil War but with the horrific addition of modern burn wounds. Nurses and doctors at Tripler Army Hospital and the hospital ship USS Solace worked without pause, using lipstick to mark M for morphine on the foreheads of the sedated. Supplies ran low almost immediately, forcing medical staff to improvise, treating shock and trauma with whatever was at hand. The air in the wards was heavy with the smell of scorched flesh and the quiet groans of men who had been healthy and laughing only hours before. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the day was the plight of the men trapped inside the overturned hull of the USS Oklahoma. As the ship had capsized, hundreds were imprisoned in air pockets within the darkness, the water slowly rising around them. Rescuers on the hull could hear them banging on the steel plates, a rhythmic, desperate Morse code of survival. Teams of civilian yard workers and sailors worked frantically with cutting torches, racing against time and the lack of oxygen to slice through the thick armor. They managed to save 32 men from that steel tomb, pulling them out through holes cut in the hull, blinking into the sunlight they thought they would never see again. But for many others, the banging eventually stopped, fading into a silence that would haunt the rescuers for the rest of their lives. Imagine the psychological toll on those cutting the steel, knowing that every inch gained was a battle against the suffocating clock ticking below. Chapter 7: The Aftermath. By midday, the smoke over Pearl Harbor was so thick it blotted out the Hawaiian sun, casting a pallid, twilight gloom over the island. The devastation was absolute. 21 ships were sunk or damaged, and 188 aircraft were destroyed, mostly on the ground. The human cost was staggering, with 2,403 Americans killed and 1,178 wounded, a death toll that exceeded many major battles of the previous century. The lush tropical paradise had been disfigured, littered with twisted metal, shattered glass, and the debris of war. Panic gripped the civilian population of Oahu, as rumors spread like wildfire that a Japanese invasion force was landing on the beaches. Residents taped over their windows, hoarded food, and prepared for an occupation that seemed inevitable in the hysteria of the moment. The military declared martial law, and a curfew was strictly enforced, turning the bustling streets of Honolulu into ghost towns patrolled by nervous sentries. Every shadow seemed to hold a saboteur, every distant engine noise sounded like a returning bomber. The tragedy was compounded that night by a heartbreaking incident of friendly fire, born of the high tension and confusion. A flight of American planes from the carrier USS Enterprise attempted to land at Ford Island in the dark. Nervous gunners, seeing silhouettes in the sky and believing the Japanese were returning, opened fire, shooting down several of their own aircraft. It was a bitter pill to swallow, a testament to that fog of war that clouded judgment and turned defenders into unwitting executioners. In the days that followed, the grim task of recovery began, a process that required immense physical and emotional fortitude. Sailors and Marines, many of whom had lost their closest friends, were tasked with recovering bodies from the harbor and the charred compartments of ships. The water was thick with debris and oil, requiring divers to navigate a dark, underwater graveyard to assess the damage. Yet, amidst the wreckage, the first signs of American resolve began to emerge from the shock. Mechanics began cannibalizing parts from destroyed planes to get a few fighters operational. Engineers assessed the sunken battleships, not as total losses, but as problems to be solved, drafting plans for what would become the greatest marine salvage operation in history. The initial paralysis of grief was quickly being replaced by a cold, hard determination to set things right. Chapter 8: A Day of Infamy. Thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C., the atmosphere shifted instantly from a quiet Sunday afternoon to a frenetic crisis command. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was having lunch in the Oval Office when he received the call from Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox. The news was initially fragmented, but the gravity was immediately understood: the Pacific Fleet had been decimated. Roosevelt, a man who had spent years trying to balance support for the Allies with American isolationism, knew that the political landscape had just been flattened. The president spent the afternoon gathering reports, his mood described by aides as one of deadly calm rather than panic. He understood that he had to galvanize a fractured nation, one that had been deeply divided on the issue of entering the war. He summoned his cabinet and congressional leaders, briefing them on the catastrophe while simultaneously dictating a speech to his secretary, Grace Tully. He edited the draft heavily, famously crossing out the phrase "a date which will live in world history" and replacing it with the immortal "a date which will live in infamy." On December 8, at 12:30 p.m., Roosevelt wheeled himself to the podium of the House of Representatives to address the nation. The chamber was packed, the air electric with a mix of fury and solemnity as he delivered a speech that lasted only 6 minutes and 30 seconds. He did not hide the damage. He reported the attacks on Malaya, Hong Kong, Guam, the Philippine Islands, and Wake Island, painting a picture of a coordinated, global offensive. The reaction was instantaneous and unified. The isolationist movement in America evaporated overnight. Men flooded recruiting stations across the country, lines wrapping around city blocks as farmers, factory workers, and students clamored to enlist. It is hard to overstate this cultural pivot. In 24 hours, the United States transformed from a reluctant observer into a unified juggernaut. Congress voted for war with a near-unanimous decision, with only one dissenting vote from Representative Jeanette Rankin, a pacifist. The declaration of war was signed at 4:10 p.m., thrusting the industrial might of the United States into the global conflict. The attack that was meant to dishearten the Americans had instead filled them with a terrible resolve, awakening a nationalism that would fuel the war effort for the next 4 years. Chapter 9: Resurrection. The Japanese High Command had calculated that the U.S. Navy would be out of action for at least 6 months, perhaps a year. They did not account for the sheer industrial tenacity of the American workforce or the ingenuity of its engineers. The salvage of Pearl Harbor began almost immediately, a Herculean effort to raise the sunken battleships from the mud. Divers spent 20,000 hours underwater in the first year alone, patching holes and sealing compartments so the ships could be pumped out and refloated. One by one, the giants rose from their watery graves, the West Virginia, the California, the Nevada, patched up and sent to the West Coast for modernization. These ghost ships would return to the war, faster and more powerful than before, eventually bombarding Japanese positions at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. It was a symbolic resurrection. The very ships that Japan believed they had destroyed returned to the Pacific to participate in the final strangulation of the empire. While the Navy rebuilt, the American morale needed an immediate offensive victory to counter the gloom of defeat. This came in April 1942 with the Doolittle Raid, a daring, almost suicidal mission led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle. 16 B-25 bombers, land-based planes never designed to launch from carriers, took off from the USS Hornet to bomb Tokyo. While the physical damage to Japan was minimal, the psychological impact was seismic. It proved that the Japanese home islands were not untouchable. Domestically, the entire U.S. economy shifted to a total war footing, producing ships, planes, and tanks at a rate that defied economic logic. Car factories began making bombers, typewriter companies made rifles. The arsenal of democracy had opened its doors, and the output was staggering. By 1943, the United States was launching an aircraft carrier nearly every month, a production capacity that Japan could not hope to match. This period of resurrection was defined by a gritty optimism, a belief that the setback at Pearl Harbor was temporary. The phrase "Remember Pearl Harbor" became more than a slogan. It was a mantra that drove riveters, welders, and soldiers to push beyond their limits. The tragedy had become fuel. Chapter 10: The Turning Tide. 6 months after the attack, the prophetic fears of Admiral Yamamoto came to pass at the Battle of Midway. The Japanese Navy, seeking to lure the American carriers into a trap, instead found themselves ambushed by American code breakers and dive bombers. In a stunning reversal of fortune, the U.S. Navy sank 4 of Japan's 6 heavy carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, all veterans of the Pearl Harbor attack. The loss was catastrophic and irreversible. Japan simply could not replace the ships or the elite pilots lost that day. The invincible Kido Butai was shattered, and the initiative in the Pacific passed permanently to the United States. It is a profound irony that by sinking the American battleships at Pearl Harbor, Japan forced the U.S. Navy to rely on aircraft carriers, the very weapon that would ultimately decide the war. Yamamoto himself would not survive the war he had predicted would be lost. He was shot down by American P-38 Lightnings in 1943, his flight path intercepted thanks to the same intelligence failures that had plagued Japan since the beginning. The strategy of the knockout blow had failed because it misunderstood the psychology of the American people. Instead of demoralizing them into a negotiated peace, the attack had engaged them in a war of annihilation. As the war ground on, the ships resurrected from Pearl Harbor participated in the greatest naval battles in history. The USS West Virginia, which had settled on the bottom of the harbor on December 7, led the battle line at Surigao Strait in 1944, sinking the Japanese battleship Yamashiro. Retribution was slow, methodical, and complete. By 1945, the fires of Pearl Harbor had long since been extinguished, but they had ignited an inferno that burned across the Pacific, ending only with the atomic clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world that emerged from the smoke was fundamentally different, our world of superpowers, nuclear anxiety, and a new global order. The attack had indeed changed everything, but in ways the attackers could never have foreseen. Closing summary. Today, the waters of Pearl Harbor are quiet again. The rustle of the palm trees and the gentle lap of the waves betray little of the violence that tore the sky apart 8 decades ago. But resting just below the surface lies the hull of the USS Arizona, a steel tomb for over 1,100 men who never woke from that Sunday morning. A white memorial straddles the wreckage, a bridge between the past and the present, where visitors speak in hushed tones and drop flowers into the water. It is said that the ship still weeps. Black droplets of oil continue to bubble up from the submerged bunkers, drifting across the harbor surface like tears. These black tears serve as a visceral connection to the past, a reminder that history is not just words in a textbook, but a living, breathing legacy of pain and sacrifice. The oil is expected to continue leaking for years to come, a slow-motion clock counting down the memory of the fallen. Yet, Pearl Harbor is also a place of reconciliation. In the years since the war, Japanese and American veterans, men who once tried to kill each other, have met at this site to shake hands and share stories. It stands as a testament to the human capacity for forgiveness and the enduring hope that enemies can become friends. The harbor represents the duality of our nature, our terrible capacity for destruction and our immense power for rebuilding and peace. As we look back on December 7, 1941, we are reminded of the fragility of peace and the cost of complacency. We honor the nurses, the sailors, the pilots, and the civilians who faced the unthinkable with courage. Their stories are woven into the fabric of our modern world, reminding us that even in the darkest of hours, the human spirit can endure, adapt, and ultimately, triumph. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. If you made it this far, you're the reason we keep going. Please subscribe and help us continue sharing these stories with the world.